The Tudor History and Travel Show is a podcast that brings Tudor history to life by exploring Tudor places and artefacts in the flesh. You will be travelling through time with Sarah Morris, the Tudor travel guide, uncovering the stories behind some of the most amazing Tudor locations and objects in the UK. Because when you visit a Tudor building, it is only time and not space which separates you from the past. And now over to your host, Sarah Morris.
Hello my time-travelling friends, it's Sarah the Tudor Travel Guide here, and welcome back to this month's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. And I'm delighted to say that I managed to get out on location this month. And it's an unusual location because I had the privilege of being invited down to London to the Philip Mould Gallery. Many of you will know of Philip Mould for his time on either the Antiques Roadshow or on Fake or Fortune. Well, Philip has a gallery down on Pall Mall, and I was invited along there by the Director of Research for the Philip Mould Galleries, Hendra, to talk about an up-and-coming exhibition at the gallery, Love's Labours Found. Well, I had a wonderful time meeting with Lawrence and musing over some of the fabulous pieces of Tudor and Stuart art that they have on display there. And I found out from Lawrence just what kind of developments have been happening in the art world that now allow us to understand so much more and appreciate so much more about these fabulous pieces of art. And so let's just go straight over and you will join me and Lawrence in conversation in the gallery in London. Hello Lawrence and welcome to the Tudor History and Travel Show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's lovely to see you in person because we have spoken before about your discovery of the Mary Queen of Scots portrait, but I haven't met you in person, so what a pleasure. Thank you for inviting us down here because I'm down here at the Philip Mould Gallery on Pall Mall in London, and this is where you work professionally.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so I'm a director and head of research here at Philip Mould and Company, and I've been with Philip for almost 10 years now.
Lovely. Okay. Now, as I said, we were talking about Mary Queen of Scots before, but we're talking about something completely different. So do you want to introduce us to the topic of our conversation for this podcast?
Yeah, so really the topic is our forthcoming exhibition, Love's Labours Found, which is an exhibition of Tudor and Jacobean portraiture, which is being staged at our gallery between 21st of April and the 28th of May this year.
Okay, so what's that all about? Because there's quite a story behind this, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. So essentially this is one of a series of scholarly exhibitions which our gallery has staged over the last few decades. And this is probably our sort of third or fourth major exhibition focusing on Tudor and Jacobean portraiture. Really, the focus of this exhibition is about discovery, really, and I suppose it's quite a pertinent time to do this because this has recently come as a result of a whole series of projects and other exhibitions that have been staged to sort of really focus the eye on this period and also to encourage people to think about it and engage with it in a way that hasn't previously been possible, and this is due really to various technological advances. Okay,
so maybe you could take us back to where this story started, because we were having a bit of a chat before this, and I think the beginning of this story links into somebody called Roy Strong, Sir Roy Strong, that's right. Can you tell us a little bit about him and how this whole project has evolved over time?
So I think one of the earliest champions in this field in terms of modern scholarship was Sir Roy Strong, and it was in the late 60s and early 70s that Sir Roy revisited this area of study and produced a number of very important publications, as well as staging several exhibitions, both at the National Portrait Gallery and later at the V&A, which really put Tudor and Jacobean portraiture back on the map. And that was probably the first time that in modern day, in a modern age anyway, that the general public were able to engage with this type of art that they hadn't done before.
So why hadn't they done that before? Why do you think that there hadn't been that same level of interest or the ability to engage with portraits in the way that Sir Roy managed to do?
Well, I always think that it was perhaps due to the fact that people felt slightly intimidated by them. I mean, I think when you're faced with a full-length portrait of an Elizabethan subject in all their sort of fine garb and their ruff and their costume, I think people felt a sort of sense of detachment. But what these exhibitions did is, by staging it at the National Portrait Gallery, a public institution, and inviting the general public in, it sort of broke down that barrier really, and it got people up close and personal with them. And I said in a way that wasn't previously possible. I mean, of course, before this, the National Portrait Gallery wasn't necessarily the obvious place you'd go to for a day out.
Yeah, right.
It wasn't. Yeah. It didn't have that accessibility, but from that date it did, and that's really what encouraged people, I think, to go in there and to see these things.
Well, thanks for explaining that, because as you say, today I think people do think of the National Portrait Gallery as a great place
Absolutely,
to go, and it's free, apart from, which is another good reason to visit, apart from the fact that their Tudor wing is stuffed full of amazing portraits. But, so that's quite a really interesting perspective, that really hasn't always been the case at all.
No.
Okay, so what happened with the story from there? Because obviously technology has advanced, and I guess art historians have continued to learn about paintings from that era. So maybe you could talk us through, because that's what we're talking, 4 or 5 decades ago. So what's been happening over those decades?
Well, I mean, so Roy Strong has a formidable memory and a brilliant eye, but the one thing that he didn't have at his disposal at that date was good photography, for starters, increased access to technological advances. I mean, yes, X-ray was around then, but it wasn't applied to portraiture in a way that it certainly is now. I mean, they were still very, very early on. In that date. So, but what's happened since then, of course, is that we've had photography has just progressed leaps and bounds. So you can now produce incredibly high resolution images, colour images as well, which have enabled scholars to sit down and to further Roy Strong's research. And also you can subject paintings now to these various scientific and technological advances that Roy couldn't have done back in 1970. And I think the next kind of milestone in terms of scholarly approaches came with the Dynasties Exhibition, which was staged at the Tate in 1995. And that exhibition, which was curated by Karen Hearn, also included in the catalogue, which is a sort of a must-have for any Tudor scholar, or anyone who has an interest in portrait from this period, you must buy the Dynasties book. And in the back of the catalogue, you'll also see that they subjected some of the paintings, certainly not all of them, but some of them, to scientific analysis. So they studied the way that the panels, the way the pictures were painted, the age of the panel, how the ground layers were applied to the panel, how the underdrawing was then applied, and the paint layers on top of that. So that was, in sort of modern day times, that exhibition again broke down another set of barriers. And from then, again, through technical advances, through the incredibly high quality of photography that you can get nowadays, that's what has now caused this sort of explosion since then.
So where are we now in terms of being able to engage with or read or learn about what Tudor portraiture is actually telling us?
Before I answer that question, actually, there is a another very important part of this sort of this line of progress, and that is the Making Art in Tudor Britain project at the National Portrait Gallery. And that started in 2007 and ran for about 7 years. And what they did was that they took a series of works from their collection and scrutinised them, with exceptional detail. They looked at the history behind them. They looked into the provenance, but also the way they were painted, and they placed them within the context of other paintings from that period. And they just subjected them to sort of very, very close study. And it was as a result of that as well that a new generation of scholars and academics came into the field. And from there, a lot of those new scholars have then gone on to focus on areas such as attribution, which hasn't always been a popular subject.
Why hasn't it been popular? And attribution means, by the way, let's just be really clear what we're talking about. What do you mean by attribution, and why hasn't it been popular?
Essentially, trying to figure out who painted what. And that's probably the best way to describe it. But attribution, it hasn't always been a popular thing. I think there's been a lot of focus on context and sort of social history and when these things were painted, why they were painted, but actually trying to figure out precisely who was responsible for painting individual portraits has in the past taken a bit of a back seat, whereas you now have a group, and a large group of people who are now fascinated with precisely that subject and are so trying to take off from what Roy Strong left off and trying to figure out who painted what and to build bodies of work for each individual artist.
I see. So what I'm understanding so far is over the last sort of 40 or 50 years, there's been an explosion of understanding through the changes in technology that's available and through this scholarly research that's gone on, such that we are now in a completely different space than we were back in the 70s, 60s and 70s in terms of appreciating Tudor and Stuart art. Is that a good summary of
yes,
a basic
absolutely.
top line summary of where we're at?
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the detail, particularly of the tech, of what that actually shows us, because I suspect there's many people like myself who watch various programs like Fake and Fortune, and they're really fascinated by seeing some of this tech. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. I don't know, could we go for a walk around the gallery and look at some of the paintings? Can you illustrate some of the things that we're able to see in the portraits, and maybe how the technology or the backstory, the research has brought that to light? Would that be possible?
Yes, no, I'd love to show you around, absolutely. I think it's worth pointing out that in terms of technological advances, they can sort of be divided into two separate categories. You have these techniques that allow you to look at the portraits themselves in these very sort of precise and intimate ways. You have sort of X-ray, of course. You've also got infrared photography. You've also you've got pigment analysis. But of course, you then also have these various advances that have enabled us to look at documents and archival materials in ways that we weren't before. Because of course, it's through the study of these documents that you can sometimes, it sometimes allows you to figure out who painted portraits, who commissioned portraits, how much these portraits cost, which again is all very important when trying to build a fulsome understanding of this period. But so digitisation, which is happening now at a scale which has never previously been known, means that you can now access wills, you can access inventories from collections the other side of the world at just the click of a button. Also it's helped with attributions because for example, there's a painting in our show by an artist called William Larkin, and when we bought this picture, we had we were absolutely convinced it was by William Larkin, but of course we needed something to compare it to, and the NPG, of course, isn't open at the moment. So we went on to the website of the Yale Centre for British Art, and they include high-resolution images of all of their paintings in their collection on their site. And there was one very similar in their collection. We were able to download in literally a few seconds a very, very, very high-resolution photo. We were able to have that on our screen, have the painting next to it, and compare them side by side. I mean, it's just... Roy Strong couldn't have imagined that when he sat down to write his catalogue 50 years ago. And that is a very good example on a very basic level, just high-resolution photography and how that has helped reshape this area of study.
What's some of your favourite, if you like, discoveries that have come out of this whole body of research over the last several decades?
Well, I personally am always fascinated by attribution. I mean, I'm one of these art historians who, in order to really understand a portrait, I want to know who painted it. Not a lot of historians would agree with me on that, but that's my personal view. I need to know who painted something, and that for me is something that I find particularly interesting. So I think all of the research that has been done both scientific and archival into those areas and trying to figure out who painted these portraits, trying to find any documentary evidence showing payment between artists and subjects, something that I find gripping personally.
Why is it so important to know who painted a painting?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and some people would say that it isn't important, but personally I like to imagine these things. I mean, I like to imagine someone going into a studio. I like to imagine having sittings with an artist, and then I like to imagine the artist painting it and all of the various elements that go into painting a portrait. Again, the materials and the process of painting and production, again, is something that I find fascinating.
It's very intuitive there. I mean,
yeah,
I
know.
I like that because I can appreciate what you're saying, because for me, when I go and see, I'm into buildings and as well as objects, and sometimes if I go and visit a place and there's just a few earthworks in the ground, I don't know, it invites my imagination to step in, and you start to me it brings colour and life, and you start to create a whole story around a painting. So I don't know, I think it would engage me more emotionally to know who painted it, what were they doing, where were they doing it, imagine what might have happened around that.
Yeah, and I think it's also to do with once you know who painted a portrait, you can then try and establish where they may have received training, and where their style comes from. Were they one of these artists who came from abroad to work in England? Were they native born? And I think knowing the identity of the artist helps understand the context in which it's painted far more clearly.
Yes, and that's the expert's perspective, and that's perfect answer for that. Yeah, absolutely. So can we go and look at some of the portraits that you have here, and maybe you could tell me some stories about them and educate me, because I'd love to find out more about them.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go. So, Lawrence, you've brought me upstairs to the upper floor of the gallery, and I'm looking at a portrait of a very fine chap. Can you tell me exactly what I'm looking at here?
Yeah, so this is a portrait by the court painter, the Elizabethan court painter, George Gower. And this was painted in 1580, and it shows a young man, very broad-shouldered young man.
Oh, yes.
with his immaculate ruff. And he's shown in his 20th year of age.
Now, a few things catch my eye immediately, if I may. Well, a few things, and in no particular order. First of all, his eyes are very engaging and very searching. He's got deep brown eyes, and I'm trying to think of, he's almost got a bit of a playful look on his face to me, but he's really inviting me in. And then I can see there's a centaur. Is that a centaur? That's holding a bow and arrow, and he's firing it at the chap. So now, and there's a Latin inscription, which I'm afraid my Latin is very dusty and I can't translate it. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more about some of those things that I've picked out.
Yeah, so of course, for starters, this artist, George Gower, was known for including this type of imagery on his portraits. And in the upper left corner, you have the centaur, and yeah, he's got a bow and arrow, and it's a reference, we think, probably to his astrological sign. I mean, it is the image of Sagittarius, and really what this plays into is a sort of Elizabethan obsession with sort of riddles, with sort of secrecy, with plays on words. So in effect, you're not supposed to really understand for certain what this is. This is all part of the visual tricks, really, that we see from this period. So in the upper left corner, we have this centaur, which is supposed to represent the image of Chiron, who was, in Greek mythology, the tutor of Achilles, or the sort of the tutor of princes. So this is a comment, of course, on his intellect. And over on the left, we see a Latin inscription, which roughly translates to "No one respires who does not aspire." Inscription is also a play on words. Aspirate is both a synonym for breathing and also a word used to mean aspire or desire. I mean, essentially what we are being told here is that those with no ambition cannot claim to have lived. It may not make a lot of sense, but that is the point behind it, because it's all part of this Elizabethan obsession with sort of secrecy, with riddles, with plays on words, and it's all part of the fun and games, really, that both artists and subjects involve themselves with at this date. Given our previous conversation, what do you think we know now about this portrait that we might not have known, sort of 30, 40 years ago, and what could you tell us about that? Well, so a couple of things here. Firstly, the subject of this work was, until recently, thought to be someone entirely different. So up until we acquired this portrait, it was thought to depict a man by the name of Thomas Arundel, but actually we now know it depicts his younger brother, William. And we know that just through something that a lot of people had actually overlooked, which is this tiny, tiny little sort of half crescent sign up there, which is a Cadency Mark. It's tiny, isn't it? It's tiny, and you see it again on top of. Oh yes, there. So easily missed. And so what this indicates, when shown on a family's coat of arms, that mark indicates that he was the second son. So Thomas was the eldest son. This indicates that the subject of this portrait was the second son, who was William. So just that tiny, tiny little mark has caused obviously considerable confusion in the past. So that's enabled us to really pinpoint for the first time who the subject of this portrait is. How fascinating. And what makes this even more interesting is that we found a copy of William Arundel's will. And in this will he mentions portraits of his mother, he mentions a painting of a saint, which was also in his collection, and he also references my two pictures. And so we're now wondering, of course, if this could have been one of the pictures that is referred to in his will. Now, of course, we'll never be able to know or prove that for definite, but these are the sort of lines of inquiries that have now opened up as a result of the digitisation of archival materials such as wills, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. Well, that's a perfect example that illustrates a couple of those points brilliantly, so thank you for that. Is there any other portrait that we could perhaps talk about? Yeah, so in fact, one of my favourite portraits in this exhibition is one which I'll show you now, which was by an artist called the Master of the Countess of Warwick. So why don't I show you that one? I'd love to. Lead the way. Before we go any further, if you enjoy these podcasts, did you know that you can support my work by becoming a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month? A link to find out more about this programme and the different levels of sponsorship available is included in the description associated with this podcast. And while I can't thank you in person, here's a big mwah to say a massive thank you from me. So, now it's back to the show. So you've brought me to see quite a small portrait of a very, very delicate looking Elizabethan lady. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about it. So this is by an artist whose name we don't know for certain yet, but is known within this field of study as the Master of the Countess of Warwick, and he's named after his most famous picture, which is the portrait of the Countess of Warwick, which is in a private collection. And this is actually the second time we've handled this picture. We handled it for the first time about 7 years ago, and I remember when it first came in, I was completely bowled over by it. And I mean, yes, it may not have the scale and the sophistication of some of these later Elizabethan portraits. This was painted in 1565, so it's relatively early. But everything about it, its scale, its condition, the fact that the subject's identity is given to us in the upper left corner, just for me really makes this a very important work within our show, and actually one of my favourite Elizabethan panel portraits, I think, that we've handled, certainly since I've been here.
Wow, I mean, that surprises me in some ways, as you say, because it's compared to, I'm actually just going to say for the listeners that just behind my left shoulder is a rather enormous and glorious picture of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, in his kind of orange-red breeches, silk breeches. And that's the kind of portrait I'd be going, wow, that would really draw your attention. And compared to that, this is very demure and quite understated. And so up in the top left-hand corner, we've got what, Maria Uxor Thomas?
Yep.
Potter, is that Thomas Potter?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so we're being told that this is Mary, the wife of Thomas Potter.
And she's 23 years old. So go into more detail and perhaps you could describe the portrait, although I will be putting an image of the portrait. In fact, both the portraits under discussion will be included in a brief blog accompanying this podcast. So make sure that you look in the description associated with this podcast for the necessary links. But in the meantime, maybe, Lawrence, you could describe it and go into a little bit more detail about why it fascinates you so.
Sure. Well, I mean, your comparison to the portrait of Robert Dudley is an interesting one, because, of course, it could not be more opposite. You've got Robert Dudley, who's sort of standing with his sort of hand on his hip, looking very confident, in comparison to this portrait, where our young subject is shown here with her hands clasped at her front in a very sort of pious, restrained type of pose. But the reason why I like this picture so much is, firstly, the condition is just so good. Now, the majority of Elizabethan portraits that we're used to seeing have suffered so badly at the hands of past conservators. I mean, let's not forget, these paintings were generally cleaned by the housekeepers in houses. And I remember going to London Library and picking a book off the shelf, a book that was published in the late 19th century, and it was like a sort of housekeeper's guide to looking after art and antiques. And to clean a picture, it recommended licking your finger, dipping it into turpentine powder, and gently rubbing the surface of the picture.
Oh my goodness me.
And
right.
So as a result, a lot of these pictures were just ruined. But this picture has survived in such good condition. And the main focal point of this picture really is, of course, the costume, because these portraits at this date it was all about sort of conspicuous consumption and showing and reflecting your wealth through your fine clothing and your accessories. Now, her dress is made of this sort of wonderful dyed black silk, but obviously to paint that, artists used black paint, and black paint, the pigments of which were so soft that they were very, very easily damaged. You had, if you imagine on a spectrum, you had lead white at one end, black on the other. Lead. White paint contained lots of lead, so it was very, very tough. Black pigments were very, very soft. So as a result, a lot of black costumes on Elizabethan portraits have been heavily abraded, and in some instances are practically non-existent now. Whereas this has survived in pristine condition. And that's what I love about it. So you can see all of this very, very fine detailing on the costume.
Yes, you can.
And that compared with this jewel at the centre here, and this ruff, which is sort of edged with actual sort of gold leaf. It shimmers. It's sort of precious. It's jewel-like, and that's why I really love this picture, because I just think it's just such a precious thing. So yes, if I could steal any of the pictures from the gallery,
this
it would be
it.
one.
You're a very modest man, but I can see the beauty of it, and I must admit the black work on her sleeves, obviously black work is a very well-known type of embroidery, but it's all over her sleeves. It's very, very dramatic. I love it. So I'm going to ask you the same kind of question about, given the conversation and the nature of the exhibition, what have we learned? Is there anything that we know has come to light about this painting and its origins, its provenance, who painted it over those decades?
Well, see, the interesting thing about this, for starters, yes, when this painting was sold at auction back in 1923, it was thought to be by an artist called Hans Ewert. Whereas now we're able to link it to this artist who we know was responsible for painting these portraits, called the Master of the Countess of Warwick. But of course, the thing is, we still don't know their identity, and that's the thing that's still missing. So this is a really good example of how we've come so far, but there are still fundamental questions which remain to be answered. But again, I personally think this is all part of the fun with these portraits. You can research these things. You can subject this to scientific analysis. You can look at the underdrawing of the way the hands are painted, the eyes are painted, but it will always come back to answering. Well, one of the big remaining questions will always be who painted it, and for that, we need to either find a signed or inscribed work, or that sort of clincher, that sort of piece of that those few lines, that clinching piece of archival material that actually allows us to link a known painting with that artist.
I see. So you've come a long way, but potentially there's just still one bit of information that you need to really definitively ascribe who painted this. But how do you know it's from the Master of the Countess of Warwick? How do you know that?
Well, as a result of the improved digital photography now, you're able to compare you're able to study so many images of Elizabethan portraits, Tudor and Jacobean portraits, and you can then put these paintings into groups. And of course, after a while, certain stylistic traits between artists' work begin to emerge. So when Roy Strong first grouped together works by this hand and gave this artist the moniker Master of the Countess of Warwick, there was only a dozen works by that hand known, whereas now there's over 50, I believe, and more of them are coming out of the woodwork on a yearly basis. And of course, the more works that you can stylistically group together allows you to build a greater understanding of that artist's stylistic traits, and so it sort of snowballs.
Yes.
And so the more works you have to go on, the more you can subject them to analysis, and then the more works you can discover.
More comparators you've
more
got, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and this work fits perfectly into his body of work. However, there is one thing that makes this painting quite unique within his oeuvre, and that is its scale. So this is the smallest panel by this artist that has so far come to light, and really that more than anything would have been down to the budget of the person who commissioned it. I mean, we think of these paintings as priceless works of art, whereas of course they were more documents of sort of a likeness, and they weren't viewed in the same way that we view them essentially. And
but still, nevertheless, pretty penny, and therefore, you did have to have a certain degree of wealth. And this is certainly a pretty wealthy lady by the looks of things, with the gold attached to her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what scientific analysis as well has showed us with this painting, and this makes quite a good comparison with the portrait by George Gower that we looked at a moment ago, is we're able to study the way that these works were actually painted, from the panel upwards. So you had the panel, you then had the ground, the underdrawing, and what makes this artist particularly interesting is the way that they worked, and that is, each layer of paint was applied, it then dried before the next layer was applied. So it was sort of built up in layers, and of course the last layer would have been the gold, which you just see touched in on the top of around the ruff and on the jewel in the centre. So it was built up over time in layers. Whereas if you now imagine a painting such as this picture here behind us, which is by Robert Peake, this was painted wet in wet. So you can see how the eyes have this sort of sense of realism, and this was painted in 1587, so some 20 years after the Master of the Countess of Warwick portrait. But you can see how that style, the styles are completely different. And that's when you said this is now the start of what would become this very sort of English tradition of painting, which was characterised by that sort of intense realism as time went on, which was of course championed by later artists such as Hogarth and Reynolds.
Lovely. So Lawrence, can you just, before we go further with this painting, perhaps you could just describe who we're looking at?
So this is a portrait of a man called Richard Wingfield, and again his identity has only recently been established in the process of researching this exhibition. And this is by an artist called Robert Peake, but this is painted relatively early in his career, in 1587. In fact, it's one of the earliest portraits attributed to his hand. But what I love about this portrait in particular is just the intense realism of the head. I mean, it's in such stark contrast to some of these earlier portraits which we've discussed, such as the portrait of the Master of the Countess of Warwick. You have that wetness in the eye and that sort of three-dimensionality which shows a step beyond what the artists of the previous generation were doing.
Yes, I could almost feel like I could run my fingers through his hair. He's got this lovely tousled hair. I just had a question. How do these leaps and innovations happen in art? I know nothing about that. How did it go from the portrait we've just been talking about, the lady painted by the Master of the Countess of Warwick, to this? How does that happen? Do we know?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's worth remembering that the demand for portrait at this date had increased massively during the Elizabethan age. I mean, this was a period of great prosperity, and obviously as the demand for portraiture increased, you had other artists coming over from the continent as well as those working in England, all of whom were sharing ideas and innovations.
Holbein was really realistic. He was obviously a lot earlier in the 16th century. So is his realism different to this realism, or how can you compare, contrast?
Yeah, well, I think what separates this painting and this sort of moment in British art is that sort of they were seeking a heightened realism, and of course, Holbein, there's no doubt in the fact that he was a sort of master of perspective, but this portrait in the head is more believable. This is more of a sort of, it has more movement, more, I would say, arguably personality than some of Holbein's portraits, which are very precise in their detail. But I think this is movement.
I see, right. I see. So it is an evolution, because I think some people listening, and my first reaction was, I was sure Holbein was into realism, and I think a lot of people might be confused by that. But to understand, actually, there is an evolution even in the painting of realism.
Yeah, I think it's realism through a painterly technique and through the application of paint in a way that isn't perhaps what you would define as sort of fine and precise. I mean, if you were to zoom in on those eyes and you were to see the white highlights in and around the eyes themselves, you wouldn't define that as sort of fine, not in the same way that Holbein was working. But it nevertheless said by creating sort of movement, it I suppose creates more drama, I think.
Okay. And is there anything else we need to know, again, about how the story of this painting has evolved over time?
Yeah, so until Recently, until literally 6 months ago, it was thought to be a portrait of Humphrey Wingfield. In fact, it was reproduced as such in various past publications on Tudor art and on publications on Peak. But again, through analysis of the coat of arms that we see in the upper left corner, we now know that it is in fact a portrait of another member of the family, Richard Wingfield. We can see here in the Cadency Mark in the upper left corner of the family's coat of arms, you can see the tiny little wings here for the Wingfield family,
Yes.
and the star or mullet, as to use its proper term, and that indicates that he was the third son. Now, crucially, we also have here a coat of arms of the Warwick family, and you can see how it's sort of floating. It's not incorporated into the shield, it's just sort of placed on top. And that is the coat of arms of this subject's wife, who was a member of the Warwick family. So we were able, through those two elements, to prove conclusively that we are looking at a portrait of Richard and not Humphrey.
That's fantastic, because it is a rather splendid coat of arms. I was going to ask you about that, so it's interesting that when you actually told me the story about that, but I'm going to be looking out for those marks. So that's a star. The other one was a slightly different mark. So do they vary then?
Yeah, they do. So each son of a family who had their own arms used different marks, cadency marks, in the upper corners of their arms. So yes, the star would be the third son, the crescent, which we saw earlier, would be the second son, and so on and so forth. And there's a huge variation of these marks. But they're very, very easy to overlook, but in instances such as this, they can prove crucial when trying to understand who you're looking at in a portrait.
Well, that's fascinating. That's completely new to me, so thank you so much for that. Okay, Lawrence, we are actually still in the same room, but I did mention this rather stunning portrait that I can't take my eyes off. It's of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Now, I've seen this before many times. It's all over the internet, but I have to say, seeing it in person is really rather remarkable. The colours, for a start, are incredible, and if you'll indulge me, because I really wanted to share this with the listeners, the detail on the face when you see the painting I've completely missed when I've seen pictures of it. So you can see the vein in his temple, can't you? And then he's got a hairy mole on his right cheek. I had no idea, but there you go. That's obviously must have been a very distinctive feature of the man. But anyway, enough of that. That's just my sort of the initial impressions, and I just find it an amazing painting to look at. But go back to our story, which we're looking at the paintings you have here in the exhibition and how you've learnt so much. What's the story with this? What are you grappling with this painting? Because obviously the sitter is in no doubt whatsoever.
No, exactly. So I think one of the main issues surrounding these portraits of Robert Dudley is who painted them. And recently, scholars have tried to reaffirm the attribution for this particular portrait type. I mean, Robert Dudley was one of the greatest and most prolific patrons of the Elizabethan age. I mean, he sat for more portraits than probably the Queen herself. But there's only a very small number of these portrait types known, as in that follow this composition and on this scale. And the current thinking, which is perfectly logical, is that the artist responsible for these was an artist called Stephen van der Mullen. And Stephen van der Mullen was an artist who came over from the continent. He worked within the Elizabethan court. He travelled to Sweden, where he painted the King of Sweden, a portrait of which was then shown to Elizabeth. And so he was very much part of that court circle. And through sort of painstaking archival research and through technical analysis of other surviving examples by van der Mullen, it's now possible to say with near enough certainty, I think, that this is a product of van der Mullen's workshop. So he's a very fascinating artist. There's lots more to be found about van der Mullen as a painter, but there's portraits by him, or thought to be by him, in collections in America, in the Yale Centre for British Art. There's one in an Australian museum, a beautiful portrait showing just the head of this type. So again, this is again, another sort of area that's currently going through reappraisal and sort of constantly being reassessed. But yeah.
So you were just mentioning the catalogue associated with this that you're putting together is quite chunky.
Yes, it is. Yeah, especially for this picture. Yeah, there's been some amazing research done by a scholar called Edward Town, who's from the Yale Centre for British Art, and he's really taken on board Van der Mullen. He's really trying to nail him down as an artist and figure out where he was living, where he was working, trying to figure out what portraits he painted. So he contributed largely to that catalogue entry, but it's well worth the read.
So what percentage certainty do we have that it's by Van der Mullen?
Well, of course, what's very difficult at this date is that you had artists who were working, but of course you also had their studios and their workshops who were assisting them. Now, of course, we may look at these things and try and figure out which bit was the artist, which bit was the workshop assistants, but we feel pretty confident that this is certainly from his workshop. But of course, there's only so far scientific analysis can really take you at this stage. So we will be describing it as a work from his workshop.
Well, I mean, it's a great painting to finish on. Thank you so much for showing these amazing paintings. So the exhibition is running, isn't it, here at the gallery? You mentioned the dates. Perhaps you could remind people when it's...
Yeah, so Love's Labour's Found. The exhibition runs from the 21st of April until the 28th of May this year.
That's lovely. Thank you so much for taking us through this story of how things are evolving, because I think that unless you are in the world of art, we probably don't realise just how much things have changed over the last few decades. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, Lawrence.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Psst. Before we finish the show, remember you can support my work via my Patreon programme, where various levels of sponsorship are available, starting at just $1 a month. Check out all the details of how to become a patron in the link included with this podcast. Oh, and don't forget, you can be part of my closed Facebook group where fellow time travellers like you hang out with me and each other to share some of our favourite things about visiting the UK. From great Tudor places to visit, to the best way to take your cream tea in an afternoon. From the latest travel news to the traditional Sunday roast. So don't miss out, and you can apply to join by clicking on the link in the description. So now it's back to close the show. Well, I hope you enjoyed that stroll around the wonderful Philip Mould Gallery in London with our host today, Lawrence Hendra. And it's a huge thank you from me to Lawrence and the staff at the gallery for making us so welcome and for opening my eyes again to what more we can understand and see and appreciate when we are looking at some of these amazing pieces of Tudor art. Well, in fact, I will be back sooner than normal because next week we have an extra special episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. I will be interviewing two lovely ladies, Linda Collins and Siobhan Clark, about their up-and-coming book, King and Collector, Henry VIII and the Art of Kingship. So if you want to find out all about how Henry masterfully made use of art as propaganda, then make sure you tune in and listen to that conversation. But until then, I want to wish you a very happy rest of the week wherever you are in the world, and I will look forward to seeing you again in the next podcast, which will go live next weekend. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. If you've loved the show, please take a moment to subscribe, like and rate this podcast so that we can spread the Tudor love. Until next time, my friends, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling! you.